So many of you probably already know, Peter Kirk was an inventor and an industrialist and also a musician. So just to get us started, I want to let you know that you may not realize that he was into heavy metal long before the likes of Iron Maiden, Black Sabbath, or even Nirvana. So my interest in Peter Kirk started when I was a child, and I learned about the town of Kirkland. I was going through some of my mom's stuff recently and found this article. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's July 7th, 1966 from the East Side Journal. My grandma sent it to my folks, and she says, Gordon, this article is about your great-grandfather, my grandfather. My mother is looking out of the upstairs window with Auntie Fanny. So of course that's the future Fanny Capron. So now we can identify some of the people in this picture down here. She wrote in parentheses, you'll want to keep this. And thankfully they did. As a young, so anyway, learning about Peter was a big deal to me because, I grew up in a small town on an island in Southeast Alaska, and we rarely had contact with our extended family. Later on, as a young adult, I found a copy of Arlene Ely's Our Founding Fathers, and I was so pleased to see a picture of my Grandma Middleton with her nuclear family. I had never seen any pictures of any of the family, actually, as younger people. I didn't even know who her parents were, really. I loved how Ely told the story of so many families in Kirkland's early days, but it did leave me with a lot of questions. This book was started humbly out of a genealogy project, and I worked mostly with Ancestry.com. I soon learned I wanted more than vital records, census sheets, and lineage charts. I wanted to know their stories. I wanted to know who they were as people. And but living in Alaska created a lot of hurdles and made research difficult. The early years with online research was slow and limited. Sometimes it seemed like the only thing keeping me going was that dogged determination of my DNA. And thankfully, Chronicling America came online, which was a godsend. It allowed me the flexibility to search when the library was closed. And of course, raising kids, I couldn't spend my weekends in the library anyway. So it was nice. And I hated those darn microfiche machines. Oh my gosh. Trying to access records at historical organizations was more problematic. It meant flying from Alaska, getting hotels and rental cars, because most of the facilities they couldn't do the lookups to the extent that I needed. And it was often a lengthy process just to get a document, or it was expensive, to have it copied. I came down to the Pacific Northwest often to visit my folks. So I'd, sneak away for a day or so to go to Kirkland Heritage Society or UW Special Collections, or, over to Friday Harbor to the San Juan Historical Museum over there to do research. But some of it, I couldn't do it all that way. It would take weeks sometimes to get documents. Like when I ordered William Sherrard's thesis from UW Special Collections, it took weeks to get it. And then there was a very quick turnaround time before I had to send it right back. And of course, Kirk's collection there was just too voluminous to copy. And so that just took time to go down and go through it. But as I collected the information, especially when I worked with the online newspapers, I transcribed most of the articles into a master document, even the littlest note, Peter Kirk bought a new horse. I typed it in with the date and whatever. And in this way, I built a chronology of events. Britain has their own counterparts to these tools called Find My Past and the British Newspaper Archives. So I was working with them also. And building this document helped tie in what was happening in Britain and sometimes explain how it affected what was going on in Seattle or vice versa to help, broaden this story. Britain also has regional archive centers with online catalogs. And at one time you could hire a researcher to do a lookup for you. You got maybe 5 hours for 160 pounds or something like that. I can't remember the exact cost. And so that's pretty expensive to keep doing that. And I did it twice. And one lady was very professional and gave me a nice report. And the other one, after weeks of waiting for her, she finally sent me a report, and it was just the regurgitated form of the background information I had provided for her. So that kind of spoiled me on that. But I found out that there was a lot of records in Chapel Le Frith, where Peter was born and where his family had been for hundreds of years. And so I knew I needed to go to England to look at those records. Again, you couldn't pay to have it all copied. You didn't even know what all it was. But that trip in 2014 was a real highlight, and I really enjoyed not only, hunkering down in the archival vault, but walking around the towns where I knew my ancestors had lived, and going to the church, where they had gone. A little quick note here. I went to church in Chapel Le Frith, and they all knew I was a stranger, right? Stuck out like a sore thumb. And there was a meet and greet part of the service. And so they all swarmed me and, were introducing themselves and, wondering who I was. And the big joke, people would ask me over there, well, what are you doing here? After telling them what I actually was doing there. And so finally, I just started telling them, well, I'm here for the weather. It's in the middle of winter, but it was far better weather than in Anchorage. So that was a pretty good excuse. But it was good going in the winter because you didn't have crowds. You could find housing, and, it was cheaper, of course. So anyway, it was a wonderful trip, and I learned a lot. Much of the Derbyshire information dealt with the ancient Kirk family, but there was some that dealt with his iron manufacturing, the Kirk iron manufacturing that went on for over 100 years in that area. And that was crucial to Peter's history. It was amazing, to hold these old parchments and other documents that were signed by an ancestor and feel that connection, not only to the family, but this history in this area. And it gave me, a closer connection, and also just a broader look on the world in general, to this country that, I had never been to before, but I could now feel connected to its history. And going to Workington, the same thing happened, and maybe even a little bit more so, because the people I ran into there had a working knowledge of, the contemporaries. Remember him and his mill, and playing around in his old mansion that went into disrepair. So I wrote this book not only to tell the story for my family, which was the original intent. I decided to publish it because I saw all these differences in things that I had read here in the States. And I wanted to fill in some of those gaps and maybe dispel some of the myths that had been purported along the way. You know, like, for example, one of the things that I had read here in the States was that after the crash of 1893, you know, Kirk, according to some sources, not all, left Kirkland, right? He went and buried his family on San Juan Island and, you know, never to be seen again. And that just is not true. Kirk and his family stayed in Kirkland for over a decade after the crash and was trying to do other business ventures and whatnot. And it would take a much deeper tragedy to propel the family out of Kirkland. I wanted to broaden the story and tell about how he became successful, but also some of his personal struggles. I wanted people interested in this history to know the man and not necessarily the epitaph of what happened to the project, you know, the steel mill. So we have these two different views of Peter that I found during the research. In Great Britain, this broader knowledge of him and Charles Valentine as men who started Moss Bay Hematite Iron and Steel Company. Sarah, can we bring up that picture of the mill? So this is Moss Bay Hematite Iron and Steel Company in Workington in 1895. And of course, Kirk wasn't there at that time, you know, when this picture was taken, but it would not have looked too much different when he did. It was a huge facility and an integrated iron and steel works, which means that they did other things like brass and tin and pig iron and, you know, just the whole gamut. It was very profitable under their supervision. And I'll just make a note here too, that when I talk about Peter Kirk, and even for the book, I center it around Peter, but we know there was a lot of other people that were involved. And, you know, especially like here in Washington, you know, Walter Williams, John Kellett, William Anderson, Leigh Hunt, all the other investors and whatnot. And in England, it was Charles Valentine, his brother-in-law, and a lot of other people. But the reputation of the product that they made at Moss Bay survived the decline of the British market share of iron production. And what Kirk and Valentine built helped the company survive for over 100 years. And that laid the groundwork with the business practices that Kirk learned growing up in the ironworks in Chapel and Lafrith, that 100-year history. Kirk's inventions streamlined the operation in labor and in fuel, and he also created new products. One of them that I'll mention later too is one of the inventions that he had was a combined chair and sleeper, and the diagram in the background on the cover is the diagram for that invention. These business practices, the inventions, built durability into the company. Because of this, Moss Bay was one of 4 companies in the area that was brought into the British Steel Corporation when they nationalized the steel industry in 1967. This was out of about 13 prominent ironworks during Kirk's time. So, the companies had slowly, gone under over the years. But Moss Bay was one of those final companies. And they lasted a little bit longer. They finally shut down in 1974, over 100 years since Kirk and Valentine built it. So we have a lot of people in Workington and around England that remember that company, and they work there. I've spoke with people that work there, during college breaks, their semesters, or their fathers work there, their grandfathers. I talked with a gentleman who can trace his family back 5 generations of working at Moss Bay. And if you look at that his ancestors were working in the mill when my ancestors were working there. It's remarkable. And that's a lot of economic stability for the area. So we know the rails that they produced at Moss Bay went around the world. And Sarah, we can look at, there we go, thank you. When you are looking at, a rail, they all have markings, and what you can see from this picture is they'll stamp it with their company name, and then they'll have a date when it was produced. So this was 1887. The tick marks before the date tell the month it was produced, and each company might have a different way of indicating that. And then you would have the weight per yard. So this is 56 pounds per yard. And that would, kind of go in side by side with how much of a load the rail could endure. And as our engines got bigger and the rolling stock got bigger and they're carrying a lot more loads, then those rails had to, be built, bigger. This picture was taken at Northwest Railway Museum in Snoqualmie, and it's very rare because it's a rail that is still in the ground. Rails wore down, even the steel ones, and they had to be replaced. And of course, like what I just said about the capacity increasing, they would have to replace these rails to provide more capacity. And so it's very rare to see these old rails still in the ground because they were ripped out and replaced and used for, scrap. Moss Bay rails were, even when they were scrapped, were considered, they were highly prized because of the high iron content. Anyway, they, the Kirk's products were sold around the world. And we see, when I sent out notices about the book, I had people writing me back and saying, oh, hey, I saw, Moss Bay rails in South Africa. I saw Moss Bay rails in Australia, of course, all over England. And that was, encouraging. I had one man from Suffolk write me and say, oh, well, when I lived in Borneo back in the 70s, I had a Moss Bay rail that stood up on end beside my house and brought the telephone lines into my house. So these things did not, they were used and used and used. Moss Bay rails helped connect the Canadian Pacific Railway. So they were, coming into North America before Kirk did. And then we also can find 60 miles worth of rail that was sold in Mexico to the Toña and Tabasco Railway. And it wasn't just his rails that were distributed around the world. The combined chair and sleeper that I told you about earlier was hugely successful. 160,000 of them alone went to Bombay in the mid-1880s. And they have an example of one of those at the Helena Thompson Museum in Workington that's stamped with the date of 1899. So we know the company continued to make this product for decades, even after Kirk had left. The earliest instance of moss bay rails that I was able to find in America so far is 1883 to 1886 in California. The Central Pacific Railroad laid about 25 miles of moss bay rails between Sacramento and Visalia, which is that I-5 corridor, relatively. And the Nevada Railroad Museum has a couple of samples of that. I don't know if it's from the Visalia line or some other segment, though. So then we come to the point where Kirk is in the States, and he toured the eastern plants, as we know. Kellett tells us he was encouraged to locate over there. He was on a mission to build a plant here in the States to avoid the tariffs, because it was extremely expensive, for the foreign manufacturers. Of course, they wanted to encourage made in America, right? When he saw the analysis of the Denny mine, of that iron ore that was listed, it must have just seemed like candy to Peter Kirk. I mean, it was just this high
Sorry, we're having a little bit of a technical difficulty with the connection to our presenter. As soon as we can get that fixed up, we'll be back on the road.
The United States. Okay, I'm sorry for that. I lost you for a second. I'm talking about the immigration status here of Kirk, and it was a problem for him. And over time, they were ratcheting down the laws because people were taking advantage. And rich nobles were coming to the States, buying up huge swaths of land and putting the underprivileged people to work just like they had in Europe. And that's what they were trying to escape. So Kirk found himself in a situation where he needed to have a real American get land for him, even though he had filed for his intent to become a citizen. And that's where Leigh Hunt comes in and helps to get the company going that way. But Kirk was a very savvy businessman, and he knew he needed good infrastructure like railroads to move the resources and products. And Northern Pacific Railroad was well established in the area. They had the most infrastructure, but they were associated with Tacoma. The Seattle leaders had been bitten by Northern Pacific and others in the past, and Denny and all that group made sure Kirk stayed focused on Seattle. Kirk stepped right into the hornet's nest of this frontier rivalry between Seattle and Tacoma. He did make progress, though, and it's amazing that he was able to balance those two groups. And they did, June 1st, 1888, they announced that the mill would be located in Kirkland. And they got right to work, and within a few years, they had the semblance of a town. They had rail lines coming in. buildings, the foundry and other buildings for the mill, and machines and equipment. They had 5,600 tons of material and machines and whatnot ready to go. Then the financial disaster swept the nation in 1893, and Kirk's efforts became a flash in the pan. And just as quickly as he appeared on the scene, he disappeared. And so local history doesn't have much else to go on from these few frantic years of construction. And even Kirk himself summed it up in a rather melancholy way in 1899. And I'll just read a little bit here of what he said. I do try to put as much of Peter's words into my book as possible, because I did want him to try and tell the story. He writes, or he said, and they quoted him. This is in the Yakima Herald. We invested $300,000 in building the ironworks in Kirkland, in Seattle suburbs, years ago. But the outcome for any profit is buried in the womb of the future. They are going to build a smelter there, and my friends have invited me to go over and see it. But with my experience before me, I tell them I'll wait and see what the result will be, as my enthusiasm is pretty well gone. And that is just so telling of Kirk. He seemed so disappointed. These couple of sentences are so different in attitude from any of the other articles I found where he spoke. He was always so confident and sure of his plans. So even though Peter's mill failed, Kirkland succeeded. Its fate was long ago birthed from that womb of the future by all the people who have lived there since and tied their fate to that area. And we can see what a wonderful town it is today. In fact, many residents today might be grateful they don't have to look out their windows to a mountain of this. You know, this is slag. But like Workington, if the mill had succeeded, maybe the residents would be thankful for the economic stability that it had provided. I'm proud of what my double great grandfather did there. Learning about Peter Kirk's perseverance amid the struggles he encountered is really inspirational. But it's not limited to him. This is the story of all the families who lived there, of the men who believed in this bright prospect then and over the decades since. So it's easy to understand under this scenario how the British could have viewed had a different view of Peter Kirk. They had the long view of 100 years of his family success in Chaplin Lafrith. They saw his own ingenuity incorporated in his company that again stood the test of time for over a century of success. For some of them, they got to ratchet around in the old mansion he once lived in. But some of them today wonder, we know he went abroad, but we don't know what happened to him. On the other hand, Americans say, yeah, he came here and he did a little something on the east side, but nothing much came of it. But both sides of the story are together now. You know, it's like Paul Harvey used to say, and now you know the rest of the story. Of course, it's not actually the rest of the story. There's, you know, there continues to be questions, and some we may never know the answers to, but it's fun to try. So now Matt might have some questions too that he wants to ask, and we can try and figure out some other stuff in the meantime.
That sounds great. And I just wanted to tell everybody that for those of us that have studied Kirkland history for a long time, Sandy was a real breath of fresh air, because you interact with the same people with the same interest, in some cases for decades. And even if you try to do your own research, there's still a little bit of a groupthink that's inevitably going to occur in a little, echo chamber. So here comes Sandy out of nowhere with all this great research and new perspectives, and really breathed a breath of fresh air into what we understood about Peter Kirk and the family, and what happened before and what happened after. There had been some good research done previously. She mentioned Arlene Ely, who wrote Our Founding Fathers back in 1975, but there really hadn't been a lot since then. So her bringing in this book was for us just incredible, an incredible plus. But I did see, just real quick, I did see a question in the chat about Kirk's free time. And I thought one of the things that you spent some time on in the book that I found really interesting, he was a musician. He was a dedicated family man. He was a religious man. He'd been an athlete. He was an inventor. He held patents on dredge heads. And you might want to explain to us of the American persuasion, what is a sleeper?
Thank you for bringing that up. A sleeper is the railroad tie. And so his invention of the combined chair and sleeper is, it was made out of steel, so it was going to withstand the wet climates a lot better. And, there's a lot of hardware that connects the tie to the rail. And his combined chair and sleeper the hardware was built in.
Did we lose her again?
Yes, I think she's just having some connection problems. So when she comes back, we can return to the interview.
Well, while we're waiting for Sandy to come back, a little point of trivia I would give everybody who is from around here. If you remember the old train tracks that ran from Seattle around the north end of the lake that we now call the Burke-Gilman Trail, those rails were originally laid in the 1880s by a short-lived railroad called the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern. And much of that line was Moss Bay rails, even when they were tearing it up. It had gone from the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern to the Northern Pacific to then finally the Burlington Northern. And those were, in many cases, leftover Moss Bay rails that they stripped up to make the Burke-Gilman Trail. Are you back, Sandy?
Yep, sorry about that. Bad internet
right.
connection. Where did I lose you?
You were talking about the sleeper, how, you get the British Empire with India and Africa and these hot, wet climates, and why that was an important invention, one of many that Kirk presented to the world.
Right. So in the construction of his invention, it was more efficient to make. It used less material, and it was also easier for the railroads to lay it because there wasn't a lot of extra hardware to put down all the pieces, connect all the parts.
So this was a guy who had not only, yes, he was born into this family, but this was not a silver spoon guy. This was a guy who got in and looked at these processes in these facilities, developed mechanical efficiencies that most of us don't understand because we're not experts on 19th century industrial machinery, but all of these little things that would make his operations more efficient or the use of the end product more efficient. We see in his notes when he's looking in our area, you had mentioned his review of the assay results from the Denny iron ore mines, which for those that don't know, were located off Denny Creek up at the pass, roughly near Alpental. There were some iron mines up there, and iron ore is one of 3 raw materials you need to make steel: iron ore, lime, and a type of high heat generating coal called coking coal. But this was a guy that could go from inventing a dredge head to jumping in and reading all the results and understanding, intimately the chemical processes required for the raw materials that he thought he was going to be needing. So he was kind of a, he was kind of a jack of all trades, Renaissance man of the era. It sounds like from what we learned from your book. I mean, he knew how to do a lot of things.
I believe that all of the Kirk family worked in the family business from a very early age. And so they would have known not only how to produce the iron, but they worked it. And they would have definitely known, the resources, the better resources to use, how it was going to react when they put it together. And, they would have all been very knowledgeable about the different chemistry that was needed to produce their product.
And that's interesting because I think we've all known people who have inherited a family business, and maybe it doesn't go beyond that next generation that inherited it, because here's the guy who's actually building on it and taking it up to the next level, or at least trying to. Another point I think that is really worth making to people that you talk about in your book is Peter Kirk came here and he and his family really integrated into the new namesake community. He joined the local church. He was an Anglican by birth and tradition. He was a founding co-founder of the Kirkland Congregational Church, which was an expansion from its original location in the Houghton area. He was a moving party behind the establishment of our Kirkland Cemetery, befriended the pioneers who had come in the 1870s, many of whom ended up investing their fortunes into the mill enterprise. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because unlike, say, Leigh Hunt, the American with whom he partnered up in the second incarnation in the Great Western Iron Steel Company, Kirkland Improvement Company stage of things, Hunt was off there by himself on Yarrow Point and doing his own thing, whereas the Kirks were very much a part of this community with the common folk that had already been here. So could you maybe address that a little bit?
Well, I think, and I don't know a lot about Victorian culture, but it seems like, what they were doing over in England, where there was like something was expected of you if you were living at this level. The Moss Bay, contributed to build a hospital in Workington, as did Kirk brothers, the corresponding ironworks and some of the other. So there were these things that were kind of expected of you, being a little bit more wealthy, to help the common man. And it also could be, early on in Kirk's life, I think he was Wesleyan, and I don't know a lot about religion either, but I think their philosophy was more of one to help people and more accommodating to people.
I think that's also reflected in the second, particularly the second town plat of the town of Kirkland, the first one being 1888, the second one much, much larger and far more detailed in 1890. And he envisioned a company town that had parks, churches, worker living spaces with yard. There was a quality of life element that we don't associate with 19th century capitalists that indicated sort of a progressive, as the term was used in that era, not the kind of politically loaded way it is now, but a progressive view towards the humanity side of operating a business like that, and making sure that you've got happy people working in your factory. And I'm wondering if that's something you could elaborate on a little bit, because I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Yeah, we hear from Kellett that when they came over, they were investigating these different towns, and he was looking at particularly Pullman near Chicago, that was laid out quite well for the workers. And I think he did have this sense that he wanted his workers to be happy and to stay there. And this might have been generated from that early Kirk philosophy in Chapel in Lafrith, where they, they tried to keep the mill going. Now, it was beneficial to keep the mill going because to keep the blast furnaces running, it took a lot of coal, right, to keep them up to temperature. To dampen them down due to lack of resources, lack of orders, some kind of mechanical malfunction, it took a lot to get it back up to speed, up to the temperature. So you try to keep that going. And one of the Kirk philosophies, the family philosophy that we read about from his older brother, Henry, is that they just tried to, keep things going. And that meant keeping the workers working. If you have to keep the blast furnace going, you might as well keep your workers going. And this would solve a lot of problems. Number one, and we all know if you have a seasonal business, every year you're trying to retrain people and you might lose your best, most skilled workers as they go out to try and find other work. But if you can keep providing them with work, then you've got that skill built in. So I think that concept of taking care of your worker might have come from that early history in Chapel in Lafrith with his family's ironworks there.
I think that kind of presents him as, again, a little bit more ethical than what comes to mind when you sort of think about a character coming over to do this. It's probably also worth just mentioning to people to give them a little bit of context that the mill complex itself that you discussed was built up on Rose Hill. And just to orient people, pretty much the property from the I-405 right-of-way east over to 124th Avenue, south of Forbes Lake and north of 85th, that was the Great Western Iron and Steel Works property up there. And then the straight shot into the original downtown Kirkland was 7th Avenue, which was in those days called Piccadilly. And then you went left on Market Street down to the lake, and that's where they had a steamboat wharf and warehouse and some other things. But the old brick buildings, all there at the intersection of Market Street and 7th Avenue, are part of that original Kirkland boom. Those were built to be the original Kirkland downtown before it sort of shifted itself to the waterfront area where it is now. But they had originally, of course, wanted to bring the railroad down into the lake area, but they ended up having to do it on the hill because the rail grade wouldn't allow them to do that. So there were a lot of logistical issues that went into where they located that. I think it's also, yeah, there we go. Everybody knows that building. Their icon.
I took that picture when I lived in Kirkland.
In the 80s. Yeah,
Yeah.
they haven't changed, thankfully.
That's just a couple of them.
Just touching on the issue of, the aftermath a little bit, and this crazy notion that he abandoned Kirkland. We know there were several efforts to revive the mill with the facilities. They didn't work out, but he never stopped really hoping that would happen there. That's pretty much correct. And then in 1910, aging and what have you, he became an important partner in the Burke and Farrar land development company, and kind of handed off the assets of the old Kirkland Land and Improvement Company to Burke and Farrar. And if you live in the greater Kirkland area, it's highly likely that your legal land description has the words Burke and Farrar in it. Burke and Farrar's division number, 26 or 40 or what have you. So even as he aged and realized that it wasn't going to be a steel center, that the next best thing of it becoming a suburb, he was still in many respects the moving force behind. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. And even though he sold a lot of the land to Burke and Farrar, he kept a lot. Him and Mary Ann, his wife, owned a ton of land in Kirkland until their deaths.
And their family home was located on Waverly Way across from Heritage Park, about where the old Waverly Junior High used to be, not the high school, not the junior high that burned in 73, but the old one over by the tennis courts where they moved the arch over toward Market Street. So he was down there on Waverly. Their home was called Fir Grove. And they had that home for until the 19 teens, right? Peter Kirk Jr. finally sold it back to Burke and Farrar.
I don't know who Peter Kirk Jr. sold the house to, but yeah, they had it until Peter Kirk died, and it was willed to the brothers. And Peter Kirk Jr. Moved there sometime after that, before 1920. I can't remember exactly when now, 1919 or something, but he kept a little piece of that part of the house property and built a separate house on it, but sold it off to somebody else.
So, and one thing I always liked was at least the fact that Peter Kirk lived long enough to see the Lake Washington Ship Canal open, because an important element of his original plan involved connecting Lake Washington to the saltwater so they would be able to ship the rails out by water. And that was one of the problems that occurred through the Panic of 1893, the giant national financial depression you mentioned, is that funding for the canal was yanked. So that was another major impact, but at least he did live long enough to see that finally happen.
Yeah, I was happy to learn that. It was probably a relief to him for sure that things were moving.
At least he lived long enough to see that was in fact going to occur. I
was gonna say this might be a good time to go to some questions in chat, but I'm gonna wait for this siren to.
Yeah. One of the things too that came up, just as long as the siren's going by, that Sandy features in her book a couple of photos. We unearthed the treasure trove a couple of years ago. We, meaning Kirkland Heritage Society, we actually found a collection of glass plate negatives, 5x8 negatives, taken by Houghton pioneer Harry French in 1889, 1890. So we not only got some never before seen shots of the mill site, but we had a couple of new candid shots of Peter Kirk and the Kirk family. The previous photos we had were the more formal, portrait types where the guy, standing there posing, but we have shots of him, standing on the porch with Walter Williams of a house he was staying in while Fir Grove was being constructed. And one of my favorites, he's standing in the San Juans with a bunch of dead salmon, and some of the kids and some of the neighbors from Houghton are in the photo. And he's up, having just been salmon fishing. And of course, he's wearing his sack suit and, tie and wearing a pith helmet and everything else, a little formal for what we think of for salmon fishing today. But it was neat getting those little glimpses. We see a photo of the Kirk kids and Mary Kirk and their, it was Margaret, right? Sandy was the lady that helped them with the kids.
Right, Margaret Hughes.
Right, in some of these photos. So that was a lot of fun having those, and thankfully we found them early enough that she was able to include some of them in her book.
Yeah, I'm very thankful for you guys for that.
Gave us some great insights. Anyway, I'm sorry. So some of the questions though from
So I compiled a list of some of the ones that have been asked in chat, and I guess the number one that comes to my mind, which I think everyone would love to know, is how was the name for the city determined? And were there other alternatives? Like, did they have a contest, or how did that happen?
I don't know.
It
June 1st, 1888, the big announcement comes out. They've already decided on the name and they just announce it. And I've not ever been able to find out if there was some kind of conversation or whatever. It was just they had already figured it out when they made that announcement, which is kind of striking in itself.
Yeah, that is.
I just to offer an opinion, because like Sandy, I don't have any hard evidence about this, and I've wondered it my whole life. The more I've learned about Kirk, particularly from her book, I would be very surprised if Kirk himself was the moving force behind that decision. I get a definite feeling he was more humble than that. I sense Lee Hunt, the promoter's promoter, the man of very peculiar talents who could sell ice cubes to Eskimos, as the old saying went. He may have been involved, or the draftsman Reichert, who did the plat, and they've just surprised him with it. This draftsman that did the town plat there. And I can imagine him being told they're going to call it that, and him, kind of thing. I just don't see him as the kind of guy that when the plat, he's not Donald Trump. He didn't want his name all over it.
That's good to know, actually. I think everyone will be pleased.
And that's just my interpretation based on, I don't have hard facts where I can prove that. It's just the vibe I get from reading about the guy.
Yeah.
Toby wants to know what Moss Bay was referring to back in England with the name of the company, Moss Bay.
Yeah, so Moss Bay is a bay that is right there on the Solway Firth. The body of water between England and Ireland is called the Solway Firth, and it's just a little bay that is on that coastline. And so the original Kirk and Valentine's company, they named Moss Bay because that's where it was located. And so he brought that name over to here and renamed, from what I understand, that bay that is there now to Moss Bay to reflect this, sisterhood between there and England.
Ah, that's interesting. And so that's why we have Moss Bay here.
Yes.
And I would add just real quick that in 1888, the lake was 9.5 feet higher. The lake level was higher. So the water line actually went to what is now Lake Street. Those buildings that are there now on Lake Street, the original ones at that location were built on pilings. It was over the lake, hence Lake Street. And the lake also went up as far as about the middle of today's Central Avenue. So it was a more pronounced bay at that time. Prior to that, it had been called Nelson Bay, which was the homesteader there, but they bought out all of his interests in his land so they could call it whatever they wanted to, and they did.
It's interesting. One person doesn't have a question, he just has a comment. He says, I love hearing this. I'm a direct descendant of the Fish family who ran Lake House. I'm sure they all mingled.
Yes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, all those early Houghton pioneers. His family, it's not the Lake House, it's Lake House. I always want to call it the Lake House, but that's not how you say it. Was built as a hotel, sort of a bed and breakfast kind of thing on the Houghton waterfront well before the Kirk era. And essentially, if you came from Seattle, you went up a long Lake Washington wagon road through the woods to what is now Madison Park, took a steamboat, a rowboat, a little sailboat, something to get across the lake. You would often overnight at Lake House and then continue your journey to the distant, hamlet of Redmond the next day. The Fish family was one of the early families that played an important role in the development of the area. It was killed me when they had to demo Lake House in the early 80s. But yeah, it was really important. So your ancestors definitely were right in the middle of all this stuff.
Speaking of houses, there's Jack wants to know, I thought this was an interesting question. He says, I found the Kirk homes in the Seattle area to be fascinating. Can you briefly describe them and what do they look like today? So I take it there's more than one.
Well, there would be the one in Kirkland, Fir Grove. And then there would be the one on San Juan Island at Mitchell Bay called Deer Lodge. They were both massive. They were huge homes for the time, elegant. Kirk had Barsh John Barsh
Mhm.
make both of them, design both of them, and he, designed kind of in that European style. Sadly, both houses are gone. Fir Grove was demolished, and I guess 3 homes were made from the building materials from Fir Grove.
Yeah, geez.
So you know how big it was.
Uh-huh.
Many, many rooms. And Deer Lodge at Mitchell Bay burnt down in 1949. The Kirk family didn't own it then. It was owned by somebody else, but sadly that home burned. There is a description in the book on both the homes, more so of Deer Lodge. There's a really nice oral history that was done by the San Juan Historical Museum by a lady that lived in that house. And so she describes just all these rooms and how they would open up these panel doors to make a huge entertainment room. And there were so many rooms, they couldn't even use them all, and windows everywhere, stained glass above it, so they were very nice homes. And thank you, Jack, for that question.
Yeah. So what was Peter Kirk's connection to the San Juan Islands? Like, I mean, how did he end up there in the first place after he was here?
Early on, when Kirk was here, they often went up to Victoria to vacation. And I think, I'm just guessing, that they just were enamored with the area. And they ended up buying like a summer home there, and in 1891, and built this house, this nice house. And so they would go up there every summer for months at a time. There was also the Roach Harbor Limestone Company there, and perhaps when he was like going around looking at all the different resources, perhaps he became enamored with the area by, going there. So San Juan Island was very much a part of the family's history from very early on, and spending every summer there. And then eventually they moved there in, I would call it late 1904, definitely by, they left in the winter of 1904 because of the death of his daughter, Marie. They were just grief-stricken. And he returned there. There's a little accounting that he was in Kirkland again after that, but I don't think Mary Ann came back to Kirkland. I think she was just too grief-stricken, and all the family moved up there too. Fanny already lived there because she had married Doc Capron, so that was already her home.
Well, Loida in the chat said that Jack might have been thinking of the Paul Hayden Kirk homes that are in the Seattle area.
That's a great point. I was actually going to say, just as a caveat, he was a mid-century modern architect here locally. As a matter of fact, he designed my original A.G. Bell Elementary School that I attended. He designed it in 1968, but he had a bunch of homes up on Finn Hill that he did, and in Seattle. So that's not the same Kirk family. That's just a coincidence.
I see. And then I also noticed that someone has their hand raised, and I'm not sure if they want to talk, but we can maybe Sarah can unmute them and allow Kent to ask a question, perhaps.
That guy's trouble.
Actually, I had no idea my hand was raised. I do not have a question or a comment.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks, Kent. Yeah, well, so we do have some other questions, though, I wanted to get to. Carol wanted to know how many kids did the Kirks have? And I think that's a very relevant question now, because we actually have some of the relatives of Peter Kirk attending this program today. So could you explain about the kids and how they all descended?
Yes.
Okay.
So Peter and Mary Ann had a total of 9 children, but their oldest child, Frank, died in England when he was a boy. And so it was 8 children that they brought over to America. And my grandmother, Marie, died, but, after she was an adult. I think only Arnold didn't marry, I believe, but also Olive never had children. So then the rest of the children did. Florence, the oldest daughter, returned to England after her marriage. So that was one part of the family that went back, and which is kind of sad, that they lost that sister, that it was harder for them to see her.
Thank you. So yeah, and thank you all you relatives that have showed up for the program today. So Lindsay wants to know if you had a favorite place when you were visiting England besides Chapel in Firth. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Chapel in Firth was really a nice visit because it's a little town and it's very quaint. And when I was there, also the place that I stayed was a couple miles out of Chapel in Firth, and it's called the Old Hall Inn, and it's actually an old manor that the Kirk family lived in hundreds of years ago. So some of the research that I've done, and also I think I've got a relative in there, Robert, who is Jeffrey Peter Kirk's son, who did a lot of research and helped Arlene Neely with her book early on. Anyway, the Old Hall Inn is in Whitehoff, and it was one of the old homes of the Kirk family from, like the 16th century. So I was able to stay there, and I really enjoyed that. And walking around, like I said, I went to the church, and, they have a meet and greet, and everybody just kind of smothered me, but they invited me afterwards to go and talk and have tea. And I met a woman that, her mother had done a lot of history, known a lot of the history in town. And she offered to take me for a walk that afternoon. And she walked me around all over Chapel in Firth and showed me all these old family estates. And a lot of this I didn't put in the book. There was a whole chapter that it was a lengthy section actually that I took out of the book because part of the information, I ran into brick walls. I just couldn't present the information with any, with the surety that I wanted. But it did trace the family clear back to the 16th century and talked about these old homes. And so she walked me all over. We went about 10 miles that day, and it had snowed. And, like halfway through this walk, I asked her, I said, Elizabeth, you said that you normally take a walk on Sunday. Is this what you usually do? No, I don't usually go this far, she says. But it was just so kind of her, and that's what I found with the people over there. They were just so kind and helpful. So I would say Chapel in Firth really was my favorite.
Yeah. Is there one person just asked just moments ago, is there a particular area or part of Kirkland that makes you feel more connected to your family and history? Like when you come to Kirkland, is there some place you like to go to that makes you feel connected?
Oh, I would definitely say Kirkland Heritage Society. The buildings, I mean, I associate with those nice buildings, but you know, I like research. Just let me fall down that rabbit hole, please, you know. So the Kirkland Heritage Society was always just such a nice place to go, and Loita was always so accommodating to let me come and research and to be around the things that they have collected from some of the family members. I think the Caper family has donated quite a bit of things, their clothes, paperwork. I love paperwork. Just to see, you know, these different things. So yeah, I would definitely say the archive.
That's great. There's one person that actually said they had a picture that they think was taken in England of the Kirk family. I don't know if that would be, let me see if I can find that. It says, oh, let me see if I can, having trouble finding that now in the chat. In the meantime, Steve wanted to know earlier on in the program how old Kirk was when he began the construction here of the mill that never got started.
Right. So Peter Kirk was born in 1840, and he arrived in Seattle in 1886. So he was, you know, in his mid 40s. He was at the, you know, top of his career, really, but still a young man.
Yeah. So it was Bruce and Karen that said, I have a family picture of all living at that time. I assume it could have been in England, as Jessie was small and Mary and the other children. I don't know. Maybe you need to hook up and see.
Yeah, that would be good for her. If Loita Hawkinson, I can assure you, would very much like to talk to her about that image, and I'm sure Sandy would too. That would be, if she'd let us scan that, I would be very, very grateful.
I'll make
it. Karen is a relative. She's from the Jesse Kirk family.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you know who that is.
Yes.
Okay. So
yeah, Karen, if we can get that scanned and you can send it on, I'm sure a lot of people would appreciate it. I'd like to point out a little, when we were, you know, getting started, I saw some of the names of people that were coming in, and I actually saw that Peter Kirk is in the house.
Yeah, tell us about that, would you?
I just recently learned about this relative. He's actually from Peter's brother's side, Thomas's side of the family. I can't exactly remember, excuse me, Peter, for not remembering your lineage exactly, but one of the sons of Thomas. And I believe he's living in the United States now too.
And I believe we have someone from Toronto here.
That would be from the Thomas side also. Thank you, Robert, for coming.
Yeah, so this has really been great. If anybody has any more questions, you know, just shoot away and chat there. If there's anything that's occurred to you, Matt, as we've been discussing that you'd like.
I just want to share my little nugget of what I learned from Sandy very recently. We have some Kirk cousins that were actually, to my knowledge, the only Kirks actually born in Kirkland, 1890 and 1892. There were two sons, two little boys, and they actually ended up returning to England in the early 1900s, and both boys enlisted in August 1914, and both were wounded, one killed at Gallipoli. And then the second one had gone home to recover, and being a young kid, what did he do? He got on a motorcycle and got in a motorcycle wreck. So it was just the two Kirk family members who were actually born in Kirkland were both died in that because of the war in 1914. That was new information to me. I saw the baptism in the Kirkland Congregational Church records, you know, the little baby, and I was like, oh, that's really sad, but I'd never known that before after all these years.
So for any budding historians or writers out there, there's still more to be discovered. That's very heartening, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's one new message in chat. Peter Kirk says, that's me. I'm the great grandson of Thomas through William and John. I lived most of my life in England, but now live in Virginia. So,
Tommy's welcome here anytime. We'll roll out the red carpet and give him a custom tour of the town.
yeah. So, unless anybody has any more questions, if you'd like to unmute yourself, your camera, and wave hello, that's totally acceptable. But if not, I think we'll be wrapping it up for this afternoon. We want to allow you a chance to leave slowly though. And so
I'm seeing a gentleman waving his hand here.
Yeah,
in the.
perhaps he wants to ask a question.
Hi.
Hi, I'm the Robert Kirk from near Toronto.
Oh, hello.
Glad to see you at last, Sandy. I made a point, but I'm ignorant about many things to do with video conferencing. I wrote a chat, but I didn't know how to send it, so it never went. I'd just like to make a point. This is to do with something that, Sandy, you were talking about half an hour ago. But the question of success and failure. When my father was doing all the research with Arlene Ely, when she was writing the book in the 70s, nobody in our family could understand why oh, by the way, I'm the great grandson of Thomas Kirk, who was Peter's brother. We couldn't understand why absolutely nobody who knew anything about Peter's adventures over in Kirkland. It just wasn't part of the family history. And there were still people in the family, including my grandfather and my father, still working in the steel industry, but this was quite unknown. And my father happened to be talking to somebody in Workington Public Library in the, I guess, early 70s. And this person said, oh, it's funny you should come in. Your name is Kirk. There was somebody here from the United States just a few weeks ago asking about the Kirks from Workington. And that is what started a lot of the connection and the help that my father tried to give Arlene Ely when she was writing her book. So that's one point. The other point I wanted to make was that my father and others thought that the period of time that Peter was developing Kirkland was really the heyday to the high point of the British Empire, and everything was success. Now, if somebody didn't succeed, this was considered a failure and nobody talked about it. And this is why they thought over there, and the sort of myth has been perpetuated that he failed, whereas in fact, really, as you have quite rightly said, he didn't. I mean, he did lots of wonderful things which really were not appreciated because they didn't fit into the mold of the British Empire, which we were brought up to think was, as they say, the greatest thing since sliced bread, but some of us have changed our opinions over the years. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, so sorry to interrupt.
Oh, thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
So we'll get together sometime, Sandy.
Yes, I hope so.
So I've got to mute myself again.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone once again for coming to this program. And we hope to have a recording that you can perhaps view from the Kirkland Heritage Center at some point. And yeah, we just want to say goodbye and thanks again. So, and I also want to give my extreme thanks to Sandy and Matt for being here on the program.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
And I appreciate everybody writing their comments. And I saw a little quick thing there that my granddaughter said hi. So